The DataGrid control is an MX component which displays data in columns and rows like a spreadsheet. In this video, you will learn how to bind data to the DataGrid control and then define which data fields to display in columns. Next, you will combine two data fields into one column display, and lastly, you will format the column data using a formatter component. This is the DataGrid control that I will implement in this video. The data provider that is bound to the control has much more data in it, but I will only display three data properties, first in three separate columns, and then combined into the two columns that you see here. The first column concatenates the first and last name fields together, and the last column displays the higher date field based on a date formatter definition. The DataGrid component is an MX component that inherits from the list-based class. It can show multiple columns of data and can include columns that are editable. Note that there is currently no Spark equivalent for this MX component in Flex 4. Some of the DataGrid control features include resizable columns, customizable columns and headers, the ability to set columns as editable, the ability to create custom cell displays, the ability to allow for multiple selection, the implementation of paging data, and drag and drop capabilities. In this video, you will learn about the first four features. The rest are outside the scope of this training series. This is a code sample for how to implement the control in MXML. Data is provided to the DataGrid control as a complex collection of objects with multiple name-value pairs. You use the data provider property to pass this collection of objects to the DataGrid control. Remember from previous discussions that the collection is usually an instance of the array collection class. Each property in the array collection is displayed in a column of the DataGrid control. By default, the columns are displayed in alphabetical order and the column headers are set to the property names. This is the starter application for this video. You can see that this HTTP service call retrieves employee information from a local XML file in the data directory of this project. The result handler for the HTTP service call uses inline ActionScript and the last result property to populate a class property named employee list that is an array collection instance. Below this label control, I'm creating a DataGrid instance with a data provider property that binds to the employee list array collection instance. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that all the data from the XML file is displayed. The header text for each column is the name of the associated node from the XML file. Note that by default you can drag the columns around to reposition the data. You can also click on a column header to sort the data. If you want to modify the default display of the DataGrid control, then you must create an instance of the DataGrid column class for each column of the DataGrid control. When you explicitly create each column, you can limit the number of columns to display, set the order in which they are displayed, change the header text, and control the formatting of the column content. This is a code sample for how to implement the column in MXML. To use the DataGrid column class, you first create a columns property for the DataGrid control. Then you create one or more DataGrid column instances that reference the data field from the data provider to display along with the header text property. I'm adding a width property to the DataGrid control with a value of 200 pixels and then converting the DataGrid tag into a tag block. Next, I'm creating a columns property inside of the DataGrid tag block. Inside the columns block, I am adding a DataGrid column instance with a data field property value that points to the last name field of the data provider. I'm also overriding the header text display by setting the header text property to a value of last name. I'm creating a second DataGrid column instance with a data field property set to higher date and a header text property set to a value of higher space date. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that there are only two columns of information displayed now in the DataGrid control. I would prefer that the first column display both the first and last names. To do this, I need to use the label function property to reference a user-defined function. The label function is a property of the DataGrid column class in this case, although it is also available in other list-based controls. In this field, you specify the name of a user-defined function that formats the column data. Note that you do not use parentheses in this function name since it is a reference to the function, not an invocation of it. When you create a formatter function, you must specify two arguments for it. The first argument is an object instance that is traditionally named item and represents all of the data in that record of the data provider object. The second parameter is traditionally named column and is data typed as an instance of the DataGrid column class. It represents the name of the column on which this function is being called. You will use the return statement and send back a formatted string. At the end of the script block, I'm creating a private function named formatEmployeeName that returns a string variable. The function takes two arguments. I'm naming the first argument item and data typing it to the object class. This function will be called for every row in the DataGrid control. Each time it is run, the DataGrid control passes all the data in that one row to the function. This item argument represents all the data in the one row that is currently being evaluated by the function. That means that within this function, you can use the item object to reference multiple data fields for display in the column. I am naming the second parameter for this function column and data typing it as a DataGrid column instance. This column argument references the name of the DataGrid column instance that calls this function. I will show you how to use it effectively in a few minutes. I'm typing return and then adding the item.firstNameValue, concatenating a literal space, and then concatenating the item.lastNameValue. Back in the DataGrid control, I'm changing the header text value from last name to employee name. I'm also deleting the data field property since this references one specific field. I'm replacing it with the label function property and referencing the formatEmployeeName function. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the employee name column now has the first and last names for each employee displayed, but the width of the column isn't large enough. I'm adding a width property with a value of 105 pixels. When I save the file and run the application again, you can see that the column fits all of the data. Next, I want to change the display of the higher date field by applying a flex formatter to the data. To do this, I need to use the label function property again to reference a user-defined function. In this case, I am naming it date format. Remember that formatters may affect the visual display of an element, but they are not visual elements themselves, so you should create them in the declarations block. You learned about formatters in day 3 of training. I'm creating a date formatter instance below the HTTP service object. I'm giving the formatter an ID property of employee date formatter. I am also applying a mask with the format string property that has a value of mm-dd-yy. This will always display the month, day, and year as 2-digit values. After the format employee name function in the script block, I'm creating a private function named date format that returns a string variable. The function takes 2 arguments, the item and column, like this one, so I'm just going to copy that and paste it. I'm typing return and then referencing the employee date formatter instance. I'm using its format function and passing it a value of item.hireDate to format the hire date. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the hire date column now displays the formatted date. Note that in the code I have hard-coded the hire date field in the format statement. Remember that the column argument represents the name of the column on which this function is being called. If you look at the DataGrid column instance, you can see that this function is being called for the column that is displaying the hire date data field. This means that the column object is the hire date. I'm updating the hire date reference in the format function to reference square brackets, which will allow me to evaluate a dynamic variable. In this case, I'm evaluating the column.data field property. This syntax translates into the statement: look in the row of data and find the column that is calling this formatter, and then apply this date formatter instance to it. This is slightly more code, but it is also more flexible code. This change will allow you to use the same date format function for other columns of the data grid, because the column.data field will now always refer to the proper column. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that there's no change to the application display. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Using the DataGrid Control.